Raja Yoga. Raja Yoga is the yoga of the education of consciousness. The man who studies Raja Yoga practically acquires consciousness of his I. At the same time, he acquires extraordinary inner powers, control over himself, and the capacity to influence other people. Raja Yoga, in relation to the psychic world of man, to his self-consciousness, has the same meaning as Hatha Yoga has in relation to the physical world. Hatha Yoga of the overcoming of the body, the acquiring of control over the body and its functions. Raja Yoga is the yoga of the overcoming of the illusory and erroneous self-consciousness and of the acquiring of control over consciousness. Raja Yoga teaches man that which constitutes the basis of the philosophy of the whole world, knowledge of himself. Just as Hatha Yoga regards the physical body as imperfect but capable of being changed for the better, so Raja Yoga regards the psychic apparatus of man as being far from ideal, but capable of being set right and improved. The task of Raja Yoga is the placing of consciousness, which is completely analogous to the placing of the voice in singing. Ordinary Western thought does not in the least realize the necessity of placing the consciousness, finds in general that ordinary consciousness is quite sufficient, and that man can have nothing else. Raja Yoga establishes that consciousness, like a powerful voice, requires proper place, which would multiply its power and quality tenfold, increase its efficiency, make it sound better, reproduce better, reconstruct the interrelation of ideas, embrace more at one time. The first assertion of Raja Yoga is that man does not know himself at all, has a completely false, distorted idea of himself. This lack of understanding of himself is man's chief difficulty on his way, the chief cause of his weakness. If we imagine a man who does not know his body, does not know the parts of his body, their number and relative position, does not know that he has 2 arms, 2 legs, 1 head, and so on, it will give an exact illustration of our position in relation to our psychic world. From the point of view of Raja Yoga, man's psychic apparatus is a system of darkened and crooked lenses through which his consciousness looks upon the world and upon itself, receiving a picture which in no way corresponds to the reality. The chief defect of the psychic apparatus is that it makes man accept as separate that which it shows as separate. A man who believes in his psychic apparatus is a man who believes in the field of view of the binoculars through which he looks, in the full conviction that what enters the field of view of his binoculars at that moment exists separately from that which does not enter it. The new self-knowledge is attained in Raja Yoga through a study of the principles of man's psychic world and through a long series of exercises of the consciousness. A study of the principles of psychic life shows man the 4 states of consciousness possible for him, which in the usual Indian psychology are called deep sleep, sleep with dreams, waking state, turiya, or the state of enlightenment. In esoteric teachings, these states of consciousness are defined somewhat differently, but they remain four, and their mutual relations remain near to the above. After this follows the study of psychic functions, thinking, feeling, sensing, and so on, both separately and in their relation to each other. The study of dreams, the study of semi-conscious and unconscious psychic processes, the study of illusions and self-perceptions, the study of various forms of self-hypnosis and self-suggestions, with the object of freeing oneself from them. One of the first practical tasks set before a man who begins to study Raja Yoga is the attainment of the ability to stop thoughts, the capacity not to think, that is, entirely to stop the mind at will, to give a complete rest to the psychic apparatus. This ability to stop thought is regarded as a necessary condition for awakening certain powers and possibilities latent within man, and as a necessary condition for subordinating the unconscious psychic processes to the will. Only when a man has created in himself this capacity for stopping the flow of his thoughts can he approach the possibility of hearing the thoughts of other people and all the voices which incessantly speak in nature, the voices of various small lives which are component parts of himself, and the voices of the big lives of which he is a component part. Only when he has acquired the capacity to create a passive state of his mind can a man hope to hear the voice of the silence, which alone can reveal to him the truths and secrets hidden from him. Moreover, and this is the first thing that is attained, in learning to stop thinking at will, man acquires the power of reducing the useless expenditure of psychic energy consumed in unnecessary thinking. Unnecessary thinking is one of the chief evils of our inner life. How often it happens that some thought gets into our mind, and the mind, having no power to throw it out, turns the thought over and over endlessly, just as a stream turns a stone over and over in its bed. This happens especially when a man is agitated or annoyed or hurt, is afraid of something, is suspicious of something, and so on. And people do not realize what an enormous amount of energy is spent on this unnecessary turning over in the mind of the same thoughts, of the same words. People do not realize that a man, without noticing it, may repeat many thousands of times in the course of an hour or two some silly sentence or fragment of verse which is stuck in his mind without any reason. When the disciple has learned not to think, he is taught to think of what he wants to think of, and not of anything that comes into his head. This is a method of concentration. Complete concentration of mind on one subject, and the capacity for not thinking of anything else at the same time. The capacity for not being drawn aside by accidental associations give a man enormous powers. He can then force himself not only to think, but also not to feel, not to hear, not to see anything happening around him. He can avoid having the sensation of any kind of physical discomfort, either of heat or of cold or of suffering. He is able by a single effort to make himself insensible to any pain, even the most terrible. This explains one of the theories of Hatha Yoga becomes easy after Raja Yoga. The next step, the third, is meditation. The man who has studied concentration is taught to use it, that is, to meditate, to enter deeply into a given question, to examine its different sides one after another, to find in it correlations and analogies with everything he knows, everything he has thought or heard above. Right meditation discloses to man an infinite amount that is new to him in things which he previously thought were known to him. It shows him depths about which it has never occurred to him to think, and above all, it brings him nearer the new consciousness, flashes of which, like lightning, begin to illuminate his meditations, revealing to him, for a moment, infinitely remote horizons. The next step, the fourth, is contemplation. Man is taught, having placed before himself one or another question, to enter into it as deeply as possible without thinking, or even without putting any question before himself, to enter deeply into an idea, a mental picture, landscape, phenomenon of nature, sound, number. A man who has learned to contemplate awakens the higher faculties of his soul, lays himself open to the influences which come from the higher spheres of the life of the world, and, as it were, communes with the deepest mysteries of the universe. At the same time, Raja Yoga makes man's eye the object of concentration, meditation, and contemplation. Having taught man to economize his mental powers and direct them at will, Raja Yoga requires him to direct them upon self-knowledge, knowledge of his real I. The altering of man's self-consciousness and of his self-feeling is a principal aim of Raja Yoga. Its object is to make man really feel and become conscious of the heights and depths in himself by which he comes into contact with eternity and infinity. That is, to make man feel that he is not a mortal, temporary and final speck of dust in the infinite universe, but an immortal, eternal, and infinite quantity equal to the whole universe. A drop in the ocean of the spirit, but a drop which may contain the whole ocean. The broadening of the eye, according to the methods of Raja Yoga, is precisely this bringing together of the self-consciousness of man with the self-consciousness of the world. The transferring of the focus of self-consciousness from a small, separate unit into infinity. Raja Yoga broadens man's eye and reconstructs his view of himself and his feeling of himself. As a result, man attains a state of extraordinary freedom and power. He not only controls himself, but is able to control others. He can read the thoughts of other people, whether they are near him or at a distance. He can suggest to them his own thoughts and desires and subordinate them to himself. He can acquire clairvoyance. He can know the past and the future. All this may appear fantastic and impossible to a European reader, but much of the miraculous is in reality not at all as impossible as it seems at the first glance. In the methods of Raja Yoga, everything is based on the understanding of laws which are incomprehensible to us, and on the strictly consecutive and gradual character of work on oneself. The idea of separation of self, of non-attachment, occupies a very important place in the practice of Raja Yoga. After this follows the idea of the absence of permanency and unity in man and in his I, and further the idea of the non-existence of the separateness of man, the absence of any division between men, humanity, and nature. The study of Raja Yoga is impossible without the constant and direct guidance of a teacher. Before the pupil begins to study himself, he is studied by the teacher, who determines the way he must follow, that is, the sequence of exercises he must do, since the exercises can never be the same for different men. The aim of Raja Yoga is to bring nearer to higher consciousnesses, proving to him the possibility of a new state of consciousness, similar to awakening after sleep. As long as a man does not know the taste and sensation of this awakening, as long as his mind is still asleep, Raja Yoga aims at making the idea of awakening understandable to him by telling him of the people who have awakened, teaching him to recognize the fruits of their thought and activity, which are entirely different from the results of the activity of ordinary people.